So welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. I'm Austin, and this is my co-host Steve Waxman. And today we've got Ossie Ahsen from Three Monkeys and Blockhead Amps, Three Monkeys Soldano, Motor Teddy. You've done a work on a José preamp, Ossie. You've done a José amp. You've done Marshmallow the One. So you've had a long career here on all sorts of things to do with Marshalls and modifications and tone and gear and guitars and so on. So we've been talking a little bit before we started recording, and we haven't really had a chance to introduce you just yet. But the first question will allow you to do that. So maybe could you just tell us about your experience modifying Marshall amps throughout your career?
Sure. So, all right. So I think the place to start would be very early on, right? To give you sort of like an idea of why this happened. So it really started at a very, very young age. And I was saying that one of my vivid memories, I have a lot of memories from childhood, but a very vivid memory would be I used to watch Mission Impossible all the time. And I was probably, 3 years old, 4 years old, something like that, the old ones that were a TV series. And there would often be a scene where someone would be in a panel somewhere rewiring something, or there was something to do with electronics. And I would go running for anything I could find in the house that looked like what I was seeing. And I would sit in front of the television and kind of mimic what I was seeing going on. And that just turned into where I would be given, my father was, he was a psychologist, but research psychologist. He would give me, he would find old pieces of broken equipment, electronics equipment, radios or televisions, and he would just give them to me, and I would take them apart and collect the parts from them and put them in boxes. And I'm very small, and I just was fascinated by it. And then I started to get into, reading about it and building little kits that were available that you could get through different supply houses, building like little crystal radios or building little amplifiers with, resistors and capacitors, crystals, using batteries and things like that. And it was just something that I was fascinated with. It just was the most interesting thing that appealed to me. So I even at one point then I mic'd up my whole house. I built like an intercom when I was probably like 9 or 10 years old, and it was made out of an old reel-to-reel tape player as kind of like the amplifier for it. Wasn't very powerful, but I was running wire all around the house and speakers and things and yelling into it like, "Can you hear me?" to my mom in the kitchen and things like that. So it was really, that was my first amplifier, right? It was making something out of this reel-to-reel tape player. And I was also lucky that I had some kids in the neighborhood, one in particular, his name was Darren, and he had an older brother, Daryl. And his older brother would go on to become an electronic engineer, an electrical engineer. He worked for Sperry. He was very much into electronics, and his brother was a guitar player, the younger one. I was friends with Darren, who was the guitar player, and I loved the sound of guitar too. When I first heard music on the radio, I heard this thing and I didn't know what it was. And I was like, "What is that sound?" And someone told me that it was, an electric guitar. And I was like, "Oh, I have to start looking into that." And Darren had one. So Daryl, I guess his older brother was the engineer type, started keying me in a little bit to different types of ways that you could use circuits other than what they were intended for. Like, here, let's take this tape head and we're going to bend it up a little bit. Now everything's going to play backwards. Or we're going to, use, the amplifier of this, and we're going to use the speaker out of it, and we're going to put a microphone in, and you're actually going to be able to hear yourself talk out of this speaker. And that was the genesis of that like intercom system. So then we had built a guitar amplifier too for Darren to use, which was really simple too. It was that same thing, a reel-to-reel tape player that went into his father's, it was like a component stereo system, the type you would have gotten in the 60s and 70s that had auxiliary ins and things, and you could have a tape deck on it. So it went from a reel-to-reel to a cassette deck into an amplifier and then out into the speakers. And when we would press record, we could plug the guitar into the reel-to-reel, overdrive the tape deck, and then play it out through the stereo speakers. And it sounded exactly like the Beatles' Revolution sound at the beginning of that just, totally fuzzed out, full frequency range kind of sound. And it was awesome, right? So that was like the beginning of it. And then later, we got spoiled and someone bought an amplifier, and it sort of started there. So I always, I was learning to play guitar with Darren. Never was, as good as he was. He picked it up easily. It was always a struggle for me, but I really loved the way that the instrument sounded, and I loved so much experimenting with it that it became, the sound was important more so than playing was. And I only learned to play as much as it was required for me to be able to make the sounds I wanted to. So that's sort of that thing. So I never consider myself to be like a guitar player. I just know enough to kind of make the noises that I want to make to hear coming out of these things. So in college, I became like, I don't know if it was like a pseudo roadie for some of the guys at school. I went to the University of Hartford, and they had the Hart School of Music there, and there was a lot of music around, right? And so there was a lot of, it's in the late 80s, early 90s too. So kids are, they're not really dialed in on their phones. There was still, every weekend someone rented a farmhouse out in the outskirts of Hartford, and there would be a party there and a band, and we would go and set everything up. So I would go out every time with whoever it was, and we'd set up the PA systems. We'd set up, the amplifiers. If something broke, I could fix it. And I got sort of like a little bit into that way. Loaning out some of my own equipment for people to use, speaker cabinets or amplifiers, pedals, whatever I had laying around. I was like, yeah, let's bring it out and set you up, and we'll try to get you sounding, as good as we could. So when I left college, I wasn't sure what to do. Electronics didn't seem like something I wanted to do as a career. So I actually started to become a golf pro, if you can believe that, right? It was kind of way out of left field, but it was another sport that I loved, or another thing that I loved, because it was one of those things too that was like, it's almost like all the things I like are also yogas, because they almost allow you to explore the universe and yourself through the thing that you're doing as a vehicle. And it's not just superficial. It's something that you can learn things about the universe from, right? You can learn things about how nature works, how things are produced, how things are generated, where they come from. So golf seemed to me to be somewhat metaphysical in a way, which seemed strange, but it did. And it gave me a lot of peace and a lot of time to walk out in the woods and, on a fairway and kind of like think. And at the same time, I was also, I had acquired a few older Marshalls in college, and had some friends that had some. One in particular that had a Lee Jackson modified amp. And I had, had my amplifiers. I also wanted to know what other people were doing. So I had my amplifier, one in particular modified by Harry Colby, who was in New York. And I used to go down there to his shop. I was somewhere around like Hell's Kitchen. And I tried to hang out there as much as I could and watch what was going on and listen. And I didn't want to give away too much, but I was like, I'm trying to figure out what you guys are doing and how you like to, work on this stuff a little bit. But I just want to see what it was, because, I had read about these guys in guitar magazines, right? So there was, at that time it was, Lee Jackson and José Arredondo, and there was Henry Yee, and there was Harry Colby, and there was Todd Langer, and these guys that had done, a lot of work for these artists that I loved their guitar tone, like George Lynch or Eddie Van Halen, or, you name it. They were working with all of these guys. So I kind of wanted to know what was their approach to everything. And reverse engineering at that point was important, right? So if I could get an amplifier and look at it, I was going to do that, right? I kind of wanted to figure out what was going on inside of them, and, what their approaches were and how they got their sounds. So that kind of informed me as to what I liked and what I didn't like, and I started basically, changing my amplifiers a little bit, trying to get them to sound closer to what I wanted, which was always, Van Halen 1 as it appeared on the album, which was, to me, the holy grail of a guitar sound. Just, how that was recorded, how it sounded through a stereo system or through headphones was just, it was this sound that just was, it had like almost a profound nature to it, which was strange because it wasn't like what he was playing so much. It wasn't like, oh, he's so fast or, oh, I thought he was a great musician, and I always liked some of his less flashy things that he did, some of his little breaks, some of his unusual kind of jazzy or almost like, bop kind of things that he would do that I thought were kind of cool. But the sound itself, it just, for some reason, it made me think of things. It was like synesthesia in a way, where when I heard those sounds, I thought of things and I was like, wow. And every time I heard them, I would think of different things. And those things had to do with, wasn't really with music. It was like, how does sound work? How does music work? How come, what are these granule sort of like textures that I'm hearing to this sound? What are these things? Where do they come from? They sound like electricity in a way. They sound like static. They sound like all these things that I can hear in other parts of the world, but and I can almost see in my vision, right? Like I can see grain in my vision and I can hear this grain in the sound, and the two were linking up together. And I was like, this is amazing. So I was like, I need to get this sound, right? So that's really where the love for that came from. It was how that sound affected me. So it began the chase of that. So we learned, I had bought at that time, the amp I had was this one right here, this small box 50 watt. And it was really close. It's a 70, right? It was really close to sounding right, but it just wasn't enough, right? I was like, it's kind of dark in some ways, but too bright in other ways. It doesn't have that kind of soft, warm, fuzzy kind of sound to it. It just sounds different. So what is he using? So then, you learn there's no internet really, right? You have to read magazine articles. There's a library, right? There's rumors. There's no Google at that time. There's nothing. You could just be like, hey, what was you? And you get, 10,000 posts about every piece of gear that was ever used. Just heard that, it was a Marshall and the front of it was made out of plexiglass. So it's like, all right, it's some kind of, pre-60s, 69 amplifier, because I knew that sort of the ones that I saw out in the wild that had, plexiglass fronts on them were, older than mine and had to be 60. So I started to search for them. And I had my friend Keith, and we were searching for these amplifiers all the time and buying them whenever we could find them. And we had accumulated some pretty, at the time, rare amplifiers. I mean, offsets, kitchen Marshalls, 18-watt combos, blues breakers. We're accumulating tubes. I mean, no one was really into this stuff as much as they are now. And you could find them in England. My sister lived in England. I could go there and look. You could find them in the newspaper. We bought some in Manhattan from different people. I bought this cabinet from some guy in an apartment building on the Upper East Side. He had a full stack at his apartment building. It was hilarious. He was a record producer from the 70s. He had gold records. I don't remember what his name was now, but he had, gold records on the wall, buying all this stuff. So reverse engineering these amplifiers and figuring out what the differences were and trying to build them from scratch now, right? Because it's like, all right, we know what they are, so let's try building these things. And I don't know if I'm getting offline in a sense, but so I think at that point, Victoria, the Fender amplifier replica company, had been out for maybe a year or so. And I'd seen some of their amplifiers in New York City at at Rudy's. And I was like, wow, I mean, that's kind of an interesting idea. And you know what? I don't know that anybody's doing that with Marshalls. So thinking to myself, maybe I could just, make Marshalls and I could, get out of this golf thing because I don't think it's really going anywhere. So maybe I could do that. So then came the quest to like figure out how to build Marshalls. So it's like, all right, now what do I got to learn how to do? All right, so I got to learn how to bend sheet metal, and I got to learn how to weld, and I got to learn how to cut metal, and I got to learn woodworking, and I have to learn how to put Tolex on things, and I have to figure out where to find any of this stuff, right? Because it's like, where do you find sheet metal from? Where do you find, like, how do you bend metal? Where do you find like a metal break? How do you learn how to weld? None of this was, because there's still no internet, right? There's still like, it's in the very beginnings of it. There's no resource to it. At best, you've got, AOL dial-up and, some of those, what are they called? Like news groups, right? With no pictures, just like some basic communication, things like that. So it was a real challenge, right? So I bought like metal from a guy that made gutters. He showed me how he bends metal to make gutters. He was making copper gutters for like high-end houses. And he kind of shows me how a brake works and all those things. So I picked all that stuff up, learned how to do it, and started making chassis. We were looking around everywhere for like, who makes transformers? Like, where can we get these transformers? So some low-hanging fruit was like New Sensor downtown. They were, pretty close to being like Korg at the time. So they had a lot of Korg parts. So you could buy like Marshall replacement transformers and, things like that. So I started using those to experiment with and to build amps out of, and getting, capacitors, all different types of capacitors and resistors from Mauser, just to check them out, see what the differences were, and just was building these things. And later on, got a little bit more in depth in terms of like the transformer design and builds, and who was doing interesting stuff. And that would be, got to know Ken Fischer a little bit, who was doing train wreck amplifiers. And he was generous with his time. If you were interested in learning stuff, he would talk to you, right? So he suggested a few people that were really good at hand winding transformers as well. So I would source them from these guys. And I found one company in particular that I really liked in Texas and used them for all the Blockhead stuff. And so the first thing was to build a 68 Plexi, or at that time, I actually thought it was a 67 because we didn't know what the serial number of Eddie's amp was. We knew it was somewhere around like a 67 from the magazine articles. So I'm like, all right, it's got to be, this kind of like Hendrixy kind of amp. So it's going to have the big, tall 3.5-inch power transformer, the big output transformer. It's going to have, lower filtering. It's going to have a lot of negative feedback. I don't want to get too technical, but it's going to be something that's not the 68. And when you plug into it and you play it, you're like, I could probably play country music with this thing. I don't think it's really, that amplifier. It was, it was kind of a shock and a disappointment, right? So it's like, this is not it. This isn't it. So it was like, all right, so we need more. So that was where, trying to get more gain out of it became the thing to do, right? So, no electronics. I know, how these things work. I have background in that. So just thinking to myself, all right, I've seen what Lee Jackson had done. I've seen what Harry Kolb had done. I never saw what José Arredondo did until probably around 2000, 2001, something around there. But I knew that the basic premise was just put more tube stages together, and it sort of worked, right? So then it became just kind of tailoring how the different stages work together, how you coupled them together, at what frequency ranges, like how you stack them. Was it going to be very bright to getting darker? Or you're just going to kind of like cut out brightness at the beginning and try to cut out low end to get more mid-range? It was all about trying to really simulate almost like a guitar pedal, like a distortion pedal, by using a tube for that instead of something like, a JFET transistor, right? So you could look at something as simple as a boost pedal for, or a distortion plus, right? If you took a distortion plus and looked at it, you could say, oh, I could just make a tube analog to this and it should work fine, right? We're going to provide a little bit of a voltage boost, of a current boost, of a signal boost. We're going to clamp it down with some Zener diodes, so that the waveform will square off when it gets to above a certain threshold. And it was pretty logical. So that's where it sort of started to take shape. And then, the José stuff, I sort of got my first sort of idea of that was when we took a trip out to Solid Body Guitar in Minnesota. And at that time, it was just like right after 9/11. I remember this was just kind of a weird story, but we flew out there and they had an enormous collection of old Marshalls. I mean, you name it, they pretty much had it there. They had Style 1 blues breakers, Style 2 blues breakers, every kind of 18-watt imaginable, 110s, 210s, 212s. They had all the JTM 45s, the split fronts, the total cloth fronts, the black flag transition ones, the super leads, the super trims. And they were kind enough. Kenny Reardon was the shop manager at the time there. And he was like, we're going to close the shop down for you. And you could just stay in here for the entire weekend and take everything apart that you want and take all the pictures and all the notes that you want of anything. And so we did that and stayed the entire weekend in the shop, just taking things apart, listening, documenting, and came back with a folder of information. And Kenny was like, the one amp I don't have, which I wish I had, was a José Arredondo amp that he loaned to John. I think he said he loaned it to John Sykes at some point. I don't know whether, where it was used or whether he used it much or whether he recorded with it or toured with it. But he was like, this was the best amp I ever had. And Sykes had come in there and, heard it and had to have it. So Kenny was like, okay, we'll work something out. So that went away. So that led me on the quest to get, the José amp. And I eventually found a couple and purchased them and, looked at them, and they were pretty much along the lines of what, I was thinking they were going to do, right? Using something along the lines of Zener diodes for clamping, extra tube stages. It was logical, right? There wasn't so much of a mystery in there, but it's like, duck à l'orange is not a mystery, but not everybody does it the same, right? And certain restaurants do it a little better than others. So it was like, all right, there is also an art form to this, right? And that's the part that probably, kept me in it the most, was that the strangeness of the way that the universe works and RF and how it couples and how things are always listening and talking to one another, and how that we're literally immersed in this soup of RF that is like, almost, you could say it is the substance of reality, right? That we're inside of, and we give it off, we take it. And the amplifier is no different. Inside of there are all of these RF signatures and pathways and sort of connections where they're kind of intercommunicating with each other or rejecting communication from each other, canceling out, reinforcing. And that part just absolutely made me think this is way more important than just, to my mind, right? I'm not interested in, like, I know I'm not going to solve any problems of the universe, right? I am not that person. I'm not Albert Einstein. I'm not one of these, string theory physicists or anything like that. But it's incredible. So you would notice, like, you could find a circuit like that was oscillating, which means that it's sort of in a feedback loop with itself, and it's listening to what it's putting out, and it's starting to create its own loop of, like, if you put a microphone in front of a speaker, it starts whistling, or it goes at frequencies that you can't even hear, so you don't know it's doing it. But you notice that if you ground your elbow on the chassis and then take your finger and kind of start moving it around, when the oscillation stops, you found the area where the problem is. So then you could start moving that wire around and it'll start changing that problem. It'll either make it worse or it'll make it better. And sometimes it's a multitasking problem that there's 3 things or 4 things that are working in a synergistical way to create your solution or your problem. And I never looked at it as being like that this is a problem. I was looking at this is behavior, right? So I'm not thinking, oh, this amplifier sucks and I can't believe that it's doing this. I'm like, this is amazing. This is, it's doing what it should be doing. I need to figure out why it's doing that and then figuring out how I can use it to my benefit. How can I make the amplifier synergistic within itself, right? How can I make it perform better and maybe get me closer to my goal of hearing Eddie coming out of this cabinet over here, right? So that was really the breakthrough, was trying to, figure out what is actually happening inside these amplifiers that's beyond just the schematic. And I think guys like Arredondo or Jackson or, any of these guys that have been steeped in this Randall Smith, or you could go through, you got to think it happened to like even Ken Brand, right? When he was building the first Marshalls in his kitchen for Jim, it had to happen to him. So all of them, I think, understood this, and all of them worked within that constraint, the constraint of that, and they developed something that was unique to themselves. So that was, something that I learned. So that's kind of like, that's really long, I think, and maybe way out in left field, but that's really what happened and how I got into it. So I don't know if that's useful or not.
No, yeah, loads of really interesting stuff there, Ossie. It's what you're saying that reminds me a little bit. I wrote a paper on something kind of like about boutique designers and so on, and one of the kind of themes I came up with was this thing about like innovative traditionalism, which is kind of like trying to work around the constraints, which is kind of what you're saying here, and it's quite interesting to hear you talk about that. Similar things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a big part of what you're doing, isn't it? This kind of creative way, this synergetic way to work around those constraints, but at the same time, kind of innovate.
Constraints are, sometimes you could call them constraints, and I agree with that entirely. Sometimes they're also serendipitous fortune, right? So you could say Ken Brand, right? He takes a 5F6A schematic, right? Because the legend is Marshall selling Fender's too expensive. Let's start making our own versions of Fenders. Let's make 5F6As. Let's get Ken Brand. Ken Brand goes down to radio spares, right? Because this is where you get your parts from, right? Your tubes, your sockets, your transformers, and all that stuff is World War II surplus. And it's different than the stuff that, Fender is using. He's got to use a different circuit board. He's using a different chassis. The circuit board's in a different place. This pot's over here instead of here. The input is over here and the wire's going this way. So the transformers are out of phase from what the Fender ones were. The voltages are a little different. He's got British tubes instead of American tubes, and he's got to figure out a way to make this sound good. And all of a sudden, he's using Celestians, right? He's not using Utahs. He's not using, the American speakers. And what does he come up with? The shape of like British rock, right? In a sense, it was the constraint was his salvation in a way, right? It was his thing. Yeah. So it was, it's like, how do you work with what you got and how do you make it do something? That's exactly, you're exactly right with that. You're exactly right.
Fascinating. Well, you mentioned some names and modders and Jose and a few guys. You're based in New York. We weren't familiar with those names, but were any and Lee Jackson? You kind of done a little bit of reverse engineering and so on. Were there any particular modders or kind of maybe technical innovations or anything that influenced you then specifically once you started to tweak and modify these Marshalls? Who do you think you were drawing most of your influence from, or maybe you weren't drawing it from anybody?
I think sometimes you're influenced by your perception of the person more so than actually what they did, right? So let's take someone like Mike Soldano, right? Like a Soldano amplifier, when I'm in high school, graduated high school or whatever, 1987, Maybe they were starting to come out. By first year, second year of college, you could see one at a high-end music store, right? And they were absolutely like jaw-droppingly cool. And then you're seeing like, the Scorpions use it, and you're seeing like, Eric Clapton use it, but you're seeing all these different people using it, but you've never actually like opened one up. But like the way that if you're growing up listening to a DJ on the radio and you put a face to that voice you hear, it's not that person, but your brain's going to do that, right? It's going to be like, oh, he looks like this and like this. And when you meet him, you're like, that's not at all what I imagined, right? The same way I'm going to do that, I'm going to develop my own face or my own concept of what this thing is. And then I'm going to work towards it. So it's almost like my perception of Mike Soldano or the mythology of Mike Soldano or Jose or any of those people influenced me, I think, more than the actual thing did. Like trying to imagine who they were and what they got. And I'm obviously completely wrong, right? Because there's no possibility that your imagination matches up with reality, right? Your brain just is going to do this on its own, and it's going to create something, and it created an impression of what it was. So then I tried to work towards what I thought it was, as opposed to what it actually was. I could say, some of the things later when I saw like photographs of things, I would take some cues from people. I thought that's a neat way of doing something. Like I'll say, for instance, I definitely took from Mike Soldano how he works with shielded wire, because I was like, that is far and away, I think, one of the neatest ways of doing it, as in it's squared away, right? So he would strip a little bit of it would strip the insulation off to reveal the shield. He would sort of fold the shield back down a little bit into a smaller area, and he would take some bus wire and wrap it around the shield to trap it there. He would solder that connection, and then he would bend this sort of like bus wire off and at an angle. And then when he would solder the core wire, right, to the potentiometer or to whatever signal lead it was, he would take that bus wire and wrap it around the ground and solder it there. So it served a dual purpose, right? It kept that wire right there where he wanted it to. So it's not going to be waving around, although shielded wire, is not going to communicate as much as other wires will, but it's not going to vibrate as bad and break loose, right? Because that's a failure point that's common in amplifiers, is right at the point where they're stripped. If it's not done exactly perfectly, you could kind of maybe squish the metal a little bit, which work hardens it, and then vibration, it gets brittle, the vibration can make it break off. And having it kind of just like that shielded thing, just kind of like hanging off and flopping around in the amplifier, that's going to be in the bottom of a tour bus. You're going to have a problem. So that sort of thing I would definitely take from somebody. So if anybody's seen like how I use shielded cable, that's Mike Soldano. That's not me. I should, every time I do that, I should say, this is Mike Soldano. This is not me. But yeah, that's how I would do things. And obviously, I took probably some inspiration from Ken Brand, who was the one who developed the first Marshalls, because I felt like his lead dress was cool. It was really cool the way he kind of like, did his little kind of like wrap with a little bit of plastic sort of like string or what have you. It would be like one around, tie, go down a little bit, go around, tie, and sort of work it around the way something like a Harry Joyce would have done on a high watt. And it was really mil-spec looking and squared away. So things like that I would take inspiration from that were in the physical reality. It also seemed as well, and this is where I think was maybe a saving grace, and I think that this relates to like something that I've heard from like Eddie as well, is that he was like, whenever he tried to cover a song, he could never make it sound right. It just always ended up sounding like him playing it. So he was like, just can't do cover tunes. And I was like, I tried to build like, whatever, like, let's say I tried to build like a SLO. And when I was finished, it was terrible. It was nothing that was usable, right? And I followed the schematic pretty much perfectly, right? So I was like, you know what? I can't build them the way that they build them. So I have to figure out a way that I can build something that sounds good. And I'm going to have to keep experimenting to find what it is that I can do and my methodology. And then sort of treat those like building blocks that I can start stacking things upon, right? So, I mean, like one of the most important things I think that people sometimes understand or don't understand is, let's say, grounding in an amplifier. If you want an amplifier that has a lot of, let's say, gain to it, right? And people call gain, a lot of signal gain, tends to amplify very faint signals to very large signals. So any kind of noise that you get very early on in the circuit is going to be amplified along with your guitar signal. Now, there's certain signals, certain noises you cannot get away from. There's thermal noise, which is, that's the universe. You're never going to stop thermal noise. In tubes, as they get hot, the electrons just, that's why they work. The platings and the coatings, the electrons just fly off of, and they go to where they're supposed to go based upon how physics works. Go to a lower voltage potential, go to this, go to that. And if there's no signal present, they're still going to be flying around, and you're going to hear that as shh, like static. So that you can't get rid of, but you can get rid of burn, right? That you don't need. So I learned like exactly how in a particular chassis to ground signals, to ground power, like things that were power conditioning versus signal grounds, and how to separate those out, how to keep the impedances sort of different enough and the potentials between those two big enough where they didn't want to communicate with each other. And that was sort of like the start of like making an amplifier that I thought was useful. And then I was like, all right, so now I got an amp that's really quiet. I know that this thing is going to be quiet. So let me start building things on top of it. So every single amplifier was like a step towards the next one. And what can I add on to this thing that's going to improve it? Because I've sort of like got the base where I want it. Now I can start adding on top of it. And it's just not going to be like, okay, what's that? Okay, that's more noise. All right, let's put this in. Oh, that's even making it worse. It just was like useful. And when I was building something in like an SLO, it wasn't. I couldn't do it the way that Mike did. So Mike, I'm sure if I sat down with him and he showed me how to do it, he was like, well, this is what you're missing right here. It's like the ground potential right here at your filament line is the same as this cathode over here. And you've got to ground it at, you'd probably show me exactly what the problem is. Or, you need to put, it has to be 12 inches between the two grounds, not 11. Who knows? But I'm sure he could show me, but I just wasn't able to do it. So I had to develop my own style. So stealing things or borrowing from things, it's good to a point, but it becomes impossible to do it note for note, because just like a musician, I think they're going to sound like themselves, whether you like it or not. So that sort of explains that.
Yeah. So you the kind of maybe the more utilitarian aspects of the kind of amp work, as you say, like the way Mike handled the wires and so on. You kind of borrowed influence from that, but maybe the more kind of like the character, the tone, the overall sound of the amplifier. You were thinking of just at a more abstract level, more is that kind of a way to look at it?
Yes, very abstract, right?
Cool. Yeah.
We didn't know what they sounded like, particularly beyond album sounds, and we all know that those are very sort of polished and curated, right?
Just something we probably should get right now, Ossie. We're talking late 80s, early 90s. Is that the kind of time period that we're in, or when you're doing this work? Is that roughly it?
I would say that let's say the beginning is of Blockhead, right, where we're starting to trying to build Marshalls, right, from scratch. That's early 90s, basically, right? So that's like after school. 93, 94, somewhere in that range is where it's really, where I'm going into, where it's going to become Blockhead, right? And Blockhead got its name because, we called like the JTM 45s that had the block logos on them were like, we called them just blockheads. So it's like, Did you find any blockheads in the newspaper, or did you find any blockheads in that music store? So that's sort of like how that came about. But yeah, it was in the early 90s, so to speak. But it was always a continuum of trying to get there, and I'm still on that, whatever that path is. I'm just further down the same path, or off on a tangent, circling my way back around to who knows where, right? You just don't know.
So just leading into the next question. So just to get the history right, the Blockhead amps, they were very authentic replicas of those classic Marshalls, right? Was that your remit with Blockhead? You were trying to make them as
exactly. So we did
high quality as possible.
Exactly. We tried to make them as exact as possible for what within my constraints again, right? The constraints thing. Mm-hmm. So we did 18 watters, we did JTM 45s and the offset, the split front, the 65s. Did a 50-watt head, like stock 50-watt head, and like a 1967 Super Lead. But then I introduced something called the Custom 50, which was a modded 50-watt head. And that was sort of like the beginning of getting into the high gain stuff. Right?
It's cool. So that gets me on to my next question. Right. So which we get into the modding thing. So how would you kind of describe or maybe talk about a specific mod to a Marshall? And we're interested to see what you say about it's comparing that tone to this kind of stock standard Marshall, those mods you were doing. We know it gives more gain, but can you tell us a little bit more? What was it actually doing to the tone, and maybe sonically how it feels? However you want to come at it.
Okay, I mean, I think what I was really looking for was the sound of that amplifier if it just would go that much more. That's it. It was like, it wasn't a lot. It really wasn't. But that was harder than it really seemed to be, So what I was trying to do was basically just create a boost that wasn't obnoxious to the front end of that amp, and then be able to control the volume of it so that you could play it at a level where you could understand what it sounded like. And it just wasn't like, how's this cucumber taste while I'm ramming it down your throat? It just doesn't work, right? So you have to be able to actually hear it, which you can't do when it's at 120 decibels. I mean, you may think you're hearing it, but you're not. It's totally a different thing. I mean, just put a mic in front of it and see what happens. So I think it was just trying to get that same Marshall sound, right, which was a very particular kind of mid-range to it that was, I want to say, thick, pointed, kind of a mid-range, but have it easier to play, right, because it would sustain more, a little easier to play, and it would sound good at a lower volume where you could use it, because using like those heads with a 212 or a 412 cabinet, there's no master volume on them. An attenuator worked, right? I used to do stuff like that for people, set them up with, what eventually would become, like wet, dry, wets, in the 80s or whatever, just, making load boxes and putting them through power and all that kind of stuff, but it never quite sounded right. So I thought you needed more front end. Tubes sound better than transistors. So let's make it sound like it's got a pedal in front of it, but better than a pedal and with a manageable volume. So we need a master volume and we need a way of boosting the front end of it. And everything else in between, that's Marshall. Let's leave that alone, right? Leave the phase inverter alone. Let's leave the tone stack alone. Find the one that you like and just kind of slam it a little bit harder. So it's really simple in a way, right? The execution of it is what's hard. The concept of it is really easy, right? It's like, just, put a turbocharger on it. But then when you put a turbocharger on your car, you realize you've just opened up an enormous can of worms, right? That you don't know where it's going to end. So the same way, it was like just trying to put a turbo on an old Marshall, and you find that you run into a lot of problems and you have to solve them, right?
I mean, maybe you can give us an idea of some of these worms, right, in the can. I mean, what were the typical problems that you were encountering once you started to add those gain stages of that? And you said you didn't want a lot more, you wanted a little bit more. What? So tell us about playing around with that constraint.
Okay, so you're always dealing with like Fletcher Munson, right? You're always dealing with these problems of how your ear hears things at decibel. right? And then you're dealing with also speaker efficiencies and how speakers work as you start to approach their capacity, right? How the curve starts to flatten and fatten, right? So in a sense, if you have like, let's say a post-phase inverter master volume or a pre-phase master, some kind of master volume, as you start to go down, you're actually changing the tone of the amplifier, right? Because you're going to have a different frequency response of your speakers because they're not being driven as hard. They're not compressing, right? They're not flattening. They're not getting fatter. They're going to be brighter. And as you turn it up, it's going to get fatter. So then your front end here, how do you deal with the fact that now, okay, so now you're getting the volume down low. You're playing it like that's a reasonable volume level to me. All right, so now we need to tailor that first gain stage to sort of make up for the fact that it's sounding thinner now, right? So how do we do that? Do we have to change more than that? Do we have to go into the phase inverter now, right? Do we have to start fattening up the phase inverter? And okay, we'll fatten up the phase inverter. We start to get a sound happening at a low volume. Now you turn up the volume and now all of a sudden the thing sounds muddy. So you're like, where is it going to sit, right? How are we going to make this amplifier sit right all the way through the volume, right? All the way through there. How are you going to be able to do that? How are you going to be able to do it with the preamp control? So things started to occur to me that, all right, so I noticed that as this goes down, right, I need to bring this up because I need more gain, right? I'm not going to be hitting the power amp as hard, so it's not going to break up there. So I need to bring this up more. So then it occurred to me, why don't I use like a dual volume pot or something like that? So as I bring this up, right, for the lower settings, it has the second volume part darkens the sound. So as you bring it up, the first preamp gets darker, and as you turn it down, it gets brighter, right? I mean, it's almost like a bright cap, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So those were sort of like, how are you going to do this balancing act between the preamp and the power amp so that the user's preferred volume, they're going to find something useful? Because otherwise you're just giving them, which, I could say you're giving them a sniper rifle that has a thick scope for this exact distance. And if you're shooting at anything that's not at that distance, you're going to miss, right? So it's a good rifle. It's going to work, but you have to use it this way. So it was like, can we make it a little bit more variable so the person can twist it a little bit, get it a little louder, a little quieter, and make it useful? So that was like that's like always been the number one problem of this whole idea of modding Marshalls, is like, how do you get it to sound good at the volumes that the person's going to be using it at, and get it to sound thick and like it's, humming along. So that has sort of like always been the can of worms to me, and how to solve that problem. That's really it.
Cool. Steve, I think I'm going to hand over to you for the next question, which is again kind of related to Marshalls and modding.
Yeah, I think this is very much continuing with the line of conversation that we've been having. So you just said a few minutes ago that, there's like this input point that you need to design for, and then there's the gain stage you want to design for, and like everything in between, you're kind of leaving most of it the same. So the question that I want to ask, which I think speaks to that more, is like, what is there in the original Marshall circuitry that has informed your approach? And I wonder if what's the stuff that's there that you really want to keep, that you think is like the heart of the Marshall sound, and that then informs the ways in which you think about the modifications that you're making. And maybe in addressing that, you could also think about how that Marshall circuitry relates to other amp designs that you've also modded or worked within. I assume, obviously Marshall is like a kind of driving passion of yours, but I assume you've also examined a lot of others for comparison. Sure. So, thinking about how those things speak to each other it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that a bit.
Sure. It's a lot of talking. I don't do a lot of talking, so my voice might start going. Great. I'm like a monk, All right, so
I do the same.
Yeah, definitely. So what do I like about Marshalls, or what do I think makes a Marshall a Marshall? All right, to me, it's two things. The tone stack is driven by a cathode follower, right? So a cathode follower would be, you have three tubes, basically three preamp tubes inside of a Marshall, a stock like Super Lead. You've got the first preamp tube, which is basically your two channels, first gain stage, the high and low input, right? The second tube is the cathode follower. A cathode follower is an arrangement of how you put two triodes together, and it drives the bass, middle, and treble controls, right? So a cathode follower is a particular circuit of two triodes that has a very low impedance, right? And it can drive. It works really well in tone stacks because they're also very low impedance, right? You have like a 25K mid pot, you have signal loss, right? So the cathode follower, I think, made Marshall sound like Marshall more so. You'll have other, like Fenders, some use, like the Bassman use the cathode follower, but a lot of Fenders, they use a plate follower. And that means that the tone, the capacitors and the resistors that make up the tone stack are driven off the plate of the tube as opposed to a cathode of the tube, right? Which has a different sort of impedance, right? So the cathode follower would be the first thing. The second thing would be the phase inverter, which is that third tube. Now, the phase inverter in a Marshall is what's called a long-tailed pair, and it uses two halves of the triode, and it kind of inverts the phase through a little RC network, resistor capacitor network, and it has two different plate resistors that then drive a signal to the power amp that are out of phase with each other. Okay. The phasing, the strength of the two sides is different for each duty cycle, each end of the duty cycle, right? So a duty cycle is basically the top of the waveform or the bottom of the waveform, right? As you're going through the midline of zero, right? You're coming up, you're going down, you're going up, you're going down. This is one half of the phase inverter, this is the other half. In a Marshall, it's more like one's up here and the other one's a little closer. And that creates a little bit of asymmetry to the sound. If you're looking at it on a scope or something, you can see it. So I think those are the things that make Marshall, right? So it's something that you would see that you could compare it to. And I'm not one of these guys, but I've, working in the business for a long time and working for a lot of different people and knowing so many different people, I've seen a lot of Dumbles, right? And for a long time, it's like I've seen so many original Dumbles. I don't know how, I know people that sell them regularly, and I got to look at them, right? And I know people are very into them. And a Dumble is very much plate drive, and a phase inverter, although it's a long-tailed pair, it spends a lot of time trying to balance the duty cycle and get them to be equal with one another, right? That's like a big part of the Dumble thing. So I think that is, moving away from the Marshall circuit, right? It gives you a little bit of a different sound to it. So that's kind of like giving you an idea of, like one versus another. So for me, I'm more Marshall, right? I get the Dumble thing, but it's not something I would, that I would spend a lot of time with myself, because it's not the sound that was stuck in my head or made me, get these synergistical kind of thoughts. But yeah, the long-tailed phase inverter, the way Marshall had it, the cathode follower, I think are the two main things of inside the circuit on the circuit card that I think are Marshall. The next thing obviously would be speakers. I mean, you can't really call them Marshall, but if you play a JTM 45 through, a pair of Altecs, you got a different amplifier in a way, right? If you play them through Utahs, you got a little bit of a different amplifier. So Celestians were part of that sound. They really had that bark to them, that mid-range kind of like bark to them. They didn't have as much top end. They weren't as, I don't know whether fuzzy or chimey or metallic sounding would be the right word, but they were different. A little darker, had more of a roll off after 3K than like a Altec did. So they had, that's another part of like amps that I thought, was part of the whole package. And if you moved away from Celestians, I felt like you were losing something, that was really the case. And people, I don't think they get that. I think people think that like speakers are just like, linear and perfect to replicate the sound that's introduced into them. And that a woofer is 12-inch or whatever is capable of producing bandwidth from 0 hertz to 500 gazillion kilohertz. And it's going to be all correct, right? But it's not. And every one of these speakers has a different frequency curve. So your speakers mean a huge amount to what your sound is. And that's one of the biggest ways that you can alter the sound, right? I mean, take Rivera, right? Paul Rivera, he should be, almost number one on this list of guys that have been, a history of modding amplifiers, or Randall Smith or something like that. They take, they put in an EV speaker into a Fender, right? And all of a sudden you've got a total new revolution coming, right? That's going to give birth to Mesa Boogie. It's going to give birth to Dumble in a way, right? It's going to give birth to that California rock sound, the Carlos Santanas, although he used, more like a JBL or an Altec, but it's going to give you that California kind of rock sound, the Steve Lukather kind of like deal, right? So if you move, that's, moving away again from Marshall. So I think that the cathode follower, the phase inverter, and the speakers are something that I didn't want to move away from. Everything else is fair game, right? Oh. Everything else. Yeah.
That's great. I love the point you're making about the speaker too, because I think it's really easy to just get really hung up on just like the wires, the capacitors, the stuff that we think of as like the guts of an amp design. But something I always am thinking about is that an amp is like a whole system, ecosystem, right? And that, like, if you don't kind of take the whole thing into account, like you're just missing the forest for the trees, so to speak. And so I think I absolutely agree with the way that you're kind of visualizing that holistic set of connections instead of just highlighting like this one little fixture in there.
It's profound.
It
is profound. If you just think about what the physics of sound is, let's say through a speaker, right? It's frequency at impedance, right? And you can plot the speaker curve. What frequency kind of efficiency is it going to have at this impedance? And there are infinite impedances going through this speaker in a sense, right? So the physics of it would be at low frequency, what is the actual impedance? I mean, this says 16 ohms, or it's actually 15 if you measure it with a meter. It says 16 ohms, but that's not the case for every frequency, right? Certain frequencies are going to pass through easier through this coil than others are. Although we're going to say it's 16 ohms, certain frequencies are going to receive a different treatment. And then that speaker, it looks backwards through the output transformer, right? And loads those power tubes. So the speaker is informing the power tubes as to how it's going to operate at different frequencies. So it's not only that the amplifier is telling the speaker what to do, the speaker's got a say in the matter. And it's yelling back through there going, hey, at this frequency, I'm going to load you down really hard. So it's not going to be, it's going to sound different than. So this is like the physics of it, which is amazing because the two are talking to each other the entire time you're playing with it. It's amazing. It's amazing. So yeah, speakers are huge.
That's great.
Yeah.
So gonna take things in a slightly different direction now, and ask you about how much in the work you've done with these amps over time have you specifically been responding to the needs or the requests or the demands that you've heard from players that you're working with.
Right.
So how many of your ideas are coming from that kind of dialogue as opposed to just from within your own?
Steve, that is a great question, right? And that may be the bane of existence of anybody that's like, I don't know, in any form of any kind. I never want to compare myself to anybody that's important, so I can't do this. But I got to say, it's like telling Picasso like what he should be painting in a way. And it's like, and it's not that you're insulting his genius. It's that he doesn't know how to do that. You know what I mean? So I remember, so Three Monkeys would be, prior to this, I was like, you can have your car in any color you want as long as it's black. I make it this way because this is the way that it works. And if I change away from it, I don't know what's going to happen. So I don't want to go off into that because it literally becomes a can of worms again, making changes to things. Like when someone says, oh, put a loop in it. I'm like, oh God, I think I need to jump off a bridge because I don't know what's going to happen if I put a loop in this. I could be stuck with this amplifier for a year trying to figure out how to make it sound the way I want it to with a loop in it. So when Three Monkeys started, right? So, I'd gotten to build some amps for Brad and Aerosmith for a few years before that. I was delivering them sometimes to the show or going up to his house up in Massachusetts. And one day he was like, well, we got to go eat. So we went to eat someplace and he goes, maybe we should do something together. So I was like, yeah, this is amazing, right? So Three Monkeys starts and I moved down here to North Carolina and I spend time building this prototype with Greg, my business partner. And we're just basically listening to Humble Pie and eating barbecue every single day. That's all we're doing. It's Humble Pie and barbecue. And we're just tweaking this amplifier for months, right? And then we get it where we're like, damn, this thing's nice. And then we start bringing it out to shows that come through the area because Greg, he's a tech, so he knows all these guys everywhere. So he's like, I'll make a call to my buddy. We'll go out there and we'll throw it up on stage and we'll listen to it and we'll see what the artist thinks. And everybody's got a different opinion about what it should be, right? Oh, could you put reverb on this thing? Maybe it should have a loop in it. Do you have like, a cleaner channel for it? And it got to be where we tried to do all those things, but we really realized that we were only wrecking what we were doing. So we kind of got to the point where we were entertaining other artists' input into it to an extent, right? Like they may say, I want to do, something that's close to a JTM 45, but I want it to be, lower power. So maybe 6v6. And we try to build a prototype and we go along those lines and maybe we come up with something that's useful. But I think the biggest lesson of Three Monkeys was you got to stick to your own guns and you kind of got to make something and it has to find an audience. And if you try chasing that audience, you're going to run until you drop dead because I don't think you can do it without compromising what you feel is what you love, So I think if you worked, I don't know how it is at other companies, right? So I can't speak to them, but maybe there's a company out there that, is like, well, we don't really care. We're just going to, build it this way and we're going to force the peg through the hole and we're going to just do this, right? I think Fender went through that. If you look at, let's say like blackface amps and the way that they were wired, and then you go to silverface amps, you start to see all these capacitors across the plate resistors and different things made to make the amp more stable because they lost the core sound of the amplifiers. They became unstable from the changes they were making to them. And probably because they didn't have the people around anymore that understood how to wire the amplifiers, how to lead dress them. So I think in general, following artists is, for me, maybe there's guys that can do it, maybe there's guys, I'm sure there's people that could write a song for anybody, right? Be like, oh, Neil Diamond or Green Day, I could write you a song, no problem, and it'll be a hit. I'm not that guy, right? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. A couple things just to throw in the mix. Yeah. From what I know of Fender, early on at least, he was like out engaging with musicians every chance he got, and it was a big part of his process. I imagine there was a point at which that, became maybe less of a focus, but I think in his early days, he was in the clubs a lot and was kind of getting folks to give him input. And he, I think he was very concerned about that. But I totally hear what you're saying at the same time about how at a certain point you have to commit to your vision and do what is going to give you the best sound. The other thing that occurs to me is with Van Halen being such a huge influence on your sound, on your ideas about sound. It's interesting to me that, in a sense, like you're chasing a sound that a specific musician himself was trying to get for himself, but that sound has become kind of like your touchstone. And you seem like now that one musician found that sound that worked so well, you don't want to necessarily mess with it in order to like get away from that ideal. Is that a fair assessment? Or
there definitely could be something to that, right? It's sort of like, which end do I want to approach it from? In a way, it's like, has my ear become so trained to this that nothing else sounds pleasing to me? Is possible, right? So like if you start, let's say, changing your earphones, right, or headphones or whatever, and they have a different frequency response, your brain eventually develops a tolerance for it and it corrects things, and you start to hear things and they sound good again. I always thought that was something interesting about amplifiers and artists that I'll kind of get into too. But also, when you're talking about Leo Fender and his working with musicians and getting their input. So you got like Rickenbacker and you got like K&F, right? Mm. And they're really like the beginnings of guitar amplifiers, right? And you're talking about like Rickenbacker's like what, like in the 30s. And then you got K&F coming in, Fender, right? The early parts of Fender in the 40s. And there wasn't anything, right? So they were building the prototype on which I'm standing on, right? So I have their bedrock underneath me already. I don't have to worry about that part anymore, right? Because they did that work for me, right? I'm standing on their work. They figured out all the things that the musicians needed to play in the clubs, right? We need it to be about this big. We need it to be about this loud. I need, it to sound good with this guitar. And I want maybe to make it a little brighter, or a little darker, depending upon where I am and what the room's like and stuff like that. He's already done all that for me. So I'm just, I'm spoiled, right? I'm not trying to invent the wheel here. I have a wheel. I'm just figuring out, what kind of tire to put on it to make it go around a curve, right? Or something like that. So if I was Leo Fender, I would have definitely had to have taken in those accounts, right? Because that's the nuts and bolts of it. But he's done that work, right? Those guys did it. I mean, Les Paul even, right? He should be in there too.
Oh, he is. Don't worry about it. No, I think that's a great way to characterize it. Like, obviously, we're much farther along in the evolution of things now, and what's known is known. So, and the proof is in the output, right? Which is it. It is. Yeah.
I'll tell you too. Like for amplifiers too. So, I think like every amplifier has a sound to it, and right in that sound is something that people find objectionable. It's just, and sometimes it takes a couple of months or a year or a couple of weeks to hear it. And then you can't stop hearing it. And that's when I think people start to look for a change. I think the like everything that you do, everything that you see, right? You're born as a child, lights coming into your eyeballs. It's totally amorphic, right? There's no shape to it, supposedly, right? Your brain eventually figures out how to put it together into something that makes sense, right? It's like, oh, that's a face, right? And, if you experiment a little with some substances, sometimes that can disappear, right? And you realize, oh my God, I'm putting this together in my head. Same thing with sound, right? It's hitting those little fibers and making the nerves do things, and your brain's putting it into sound. And is it real? Is that really what you're hearing, or is it interpretation? So I think a lot of times artists, they get sick of what they're hearing for one reason or another. And then when you give them a new amplifier, that thing that they didn't like isn't there anymore, just as a matter of chance. And now they're like, this thing sounds great. I'm happy again. And they'll play it. And then after a while, it starts to sound weird again. Their brain puts it together in a way where they don't like something. Something about the psychology makes us impossible to satisfy. So that's like even Eddie changing amplifiers, his sound changing over the years. Although I must say I credit Don Landy, and I think more than anybody, in terms of, getting those kinds of sounds that you actually hear on a record. But I remember bringing a prototype amp once to Brad, And it was like one of the first times we really kind of worked together. And it was in Philadelphia. And I'm bringing this like hunk of junk on that's like bolted to a piece of plywood. And I throw it up on stage, and he's playing some of Fred DeCone's amps, right? Divided by at the time. And he's playing it out during sound check. And I'm listening to this thing, and I'm like, what is he doing? He wants to change that? You know, I mean, this is just absolutely killer. I mean, it was nuts how good this rig sounded. And he comes over, he goes, what do you think? I go, why do you want another amp? And, you know, I'm like, just like, I want to go home, because that's just like, you know, it's so good. But he's like, you know, I think it complements the divided by. So, you know, maybe he's throwing me a bone here. Maybe he's being nice. I don't know. But that's where I started to come up with the concept. Like, I don't think he's hearing the same thing I'm hearing. I don't think that could be possible. Maybe he's just been playing it too long or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I started to see that more and more. So maybe that goes back to following an artist's wants. Maybe sometimes that could be a good thing. If you work with that artist like this, maybe you could be useful to him and be like, how about this now? And be like, oh yeah, that shit's gone now. We're good. Thank you. Yeah. I can play again for a little while. So yeah, maybe there's something there. I don't know.
Cool.
It's a good idea. I like this.
Yeah. So staying with the notion of like how musicians are like using these amps and you know, how their own playing is being shaped by it. I wonder if in your experience you've seen instances where a player's technique or style has really been specifically shaped by the sorts of modifications that you've done on these amps, or that you've seen other amp technicians make in a similar vein with these Marshall amp modifications to get the, you know, better gain, the more defined sound and such. Have you seen any really tangible instances of musicians whose techniques seem to be somehow motivated by those changes?
I think it's universal. I don't think there's a way around it. Okay. I think that it's like that rider and horse theory of, like, you know, Buddhism, right? It's sort of which is which, who's in control. Are we reacting to one another? Who's the rider? Who's the horse? Who's more important? Who's controlling? It's impossible to know. But I can tell you for sure, everybody I hear has a bit of a different sound in the way that they play, right? So, like, for instance, when I would play, when we were developing the orangutan, like the first prototype for Three Monkeys, when I would play it versus Greg would play it, we would sound different through it. And then when Brad would play it, he would sound different through it. But if you played with it enough, you would start to, you know, I'm going to kind of get a little bit more meat here on the string, or I'm going to pick it a little bit more here. It's almost unconscious, I think, that people will start to adapt to what they're given, right? They're gonna first time you plug into an amp, right? It's kind of like, oh, plug it in, you turn on, the thing starts squealing. You're like turning away from it right away, turning down on it. Then you got to kind of find your spot, and you're kind of like shielding the pickup a little bit, and then you're picking it a little bit. You're like, all right, where's my spot? You're getting it right on the part of the string that sounds right to you. So I think you're always adapting to what you're given, right? So the question becomes, can the person maybe adapt to what you've given them? Or is it something that's too far outside of the, let's say, parameters of the window of workability for that player, right? Are they a very dark player? Like, do they mute everything? Like, are they always have their hand some way on the strings? Do they pick up by the neck? Are they picking way back? What kind of pick are they using? Right? So all of that, I think, informs the choice of amplifier that they use. Right? So that goes back to, I think, to, can you design an amp, one amp for everybody? If they adapt to it, sure. But I think everybody adapts a little bit differently to the amplifiers, and every amplifier sounds a little bit different. Even when you make them over and over again, the units may sound from one to another a little different. Some may be a little bit brighter, a little darker, attribute to maybe a tube difference or stacked tolerances of components, what have you. But there's going to be give and take there. I think there has to be. Like, you can adjust it a little bit and then try to get it within the window of operation for the most amount of players that you can. But in the end, that player, I think, has to adapt to what you've given them, or it's not going to work. You know, I think that's the case.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, these
Austin,
are really good questions, Steve. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is fun. We're enjoying it too.
Yeah,
I'm glad you're
absolutely.
enjoying it. I think we're going to pass it back over to Austin for a couple.
Okay, Austin.
You give us a kind of explanation for gear acquisition syndrome there as well, didn't you? By saying that eventually people start to just dislike something about that tone, and that's why they then chase the next amplifier.
I think so.
Which is quite interesting. Okay, on to a little bit off tone now and the tech. In terms of kind of your interaction with, let's just say, the community around amplification modding, amplification building more generally, how would you say your kind of interaction with, you talked about different technicians, you talked about different guitar players you've worked, musicians and so on. How would you say those interactions have sort of kind of shaped a sense of a community, and that can be in real life or it can be online?
Well, a community among amp builders, or community among musicians and amp builders, or community out maybe a little bit more?
More around the amp builders, or specifically amp modders, within that kind of community.
Sure. I think it's all right. So I think it definitely, there is a community. So for instance, like, let's say, I haven't done this in a long time, right? But I used to do amp shows. So there'd be an amp show in different, like in New Jersey or in Austin, Texas, or California, or here in Raleigh, wherever. And then you would get, boutique guys would come to those things, right? You would also occasionally get some of the big players that would come in, right? Like maybe Marshall might come once or twice, or, you definitely get Celestion or some of the universal sort of like component companies that work with all of the amp builders. But when the show was over and you're all still in the hotel, yeah, there's definitely some community going on for sure. Like, I've had a lot of fun with like George Metropolis. I mean, just a blast to be around. I'll forget too many people like that. It's just great hangs, right? Because we all enjoy doing the same things, and we all have kind of like similar experiences. So I think there's definitely like a shared sort of like understanding of the problems you face, and of the idiosyncrasies of the business, and the sort of like funnier aspects of the business, that there's a lot of inside humor there. So I think there's definitely a community in that way. On top of that, I'll also say there has to be a sense too of competition, right? So I think there's always competition among builders, and I think that's a good thing, right? So who's doing what? It's kind of like, I think the way that like bands might compete with each other in a sense, like I could imagine, not there, but I could imagine like LA in like 1975, and everybody's like going to each other's shows, and they're hanging out in the back of the room in the dark corner, like watching, going, "Did you see that? Look what he's doing. We should do that," or something like that. We're competing with those guys. We need to do. So there's some of that. So there is some competition. I would also say that I think you really need to keep your head down, because if you get into too much competition with somebody, you're going to start making decisions based upon that, as opposed to listening to yourself and continuing with your own art form, right? It's sort of like you're going to become two race car drivers that are so obsessed they're going to hit the wall now, because they're just not paying attention to what they're doing anymore. They're looking to get ahead of the next person. So I think there's some of that. there's definitely the appearance of secrets, right, in the community, like who's doing what, who's using what, what's their secret, like gooing with Dumble. There's definitely that kind of thing in the community, a secretive nature of it. It's in itself like a microcosm of the broader society. It contains all of the same things that you would see in broader society, jealousy, sympathy, love, competition, camaraderie, all of the things I think that you would see in general society, or really even in any subsection of society, any profession. I think it contains those same elements. It just becomes a little bit more niche in what the similarities, differences, and sticking points might be. But it's very much, I think, a community, and everybody has heard of everybody, even if they don't want to admit it. Right?
Cool.
So, yeah.
You've maybe you've kind of focused a little bit on, once you were established and, the kind of community around the trade shows and so on. Again, you can expand this maybe to, when you were starting out, and, before the internet or before you became established. Did you have any mentors or any little small networks around your area where you could exchange ideas, or was there any secrecy, or were you on your own, or how did it all work then when you were starting out?
Totally on my own, it felt like. There was I don't know what the word would be. I'm definitely like an autodidactic, right? Like anything, I'm unteachable. That's number one. That's the first thing you have to understand. I am unteachable. It's not possible. If I'm to learn anything, I have to learn it myself. You can give it to me and you can speak it to me, and I'm going to be able to recite what you told me and regurgitate it, but I'm not going to understand it at any level that allows me to work with the information at any kind of level that's meaningful, right? So I have to teach myself it, and it comes hard. It's not like the easiest thing in the world. It's not like you just sit there and it's like people tell you things and it makes sense. It's like, every day it's like, you're like, that's what he was saying 45 years ago. You know what I mean? And you get these, you finally understand things. So at that point, if someone told me what to do, it wouldn't have worked. I had to electrocute myself, right? I had to, make mistakes. I had to spend time, getting my welder stuck to the aluminum every inch, it was, there wasn't really any way around that. I don't know if there is a community for it, because I also think this business, or this profession, if you want to call it, this hobby, this thing, attracts the kind of person that I think is more comfortable spending time in seclusion and working and thinking and musing about things. I think it's kind of like the nature of the beast. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like Ken Fischer or Alexander, right? Dumble. They're, reclusive in a way, right? You spend more time by yourself. You're not really interested too much in, being around too many people all the time. I think maybe it could be just, you're driven, or you have, maybe too many thoughts going on in your head to pay attention to anybody else. I don't know. But definitely in the beginning, it's always kind of been like, it's a very solitary kind of like occupation, I think,
And what about that period, Ossie, in the 2000s or the late 90s, where the internet, was starting to take off, and you said there was some user groups, and then the forums popped up, and there seemed to be a bit of reverse engineering going on. There seemed to be a bit of a kind of culture. Did you get involved much in that? Did you have much experience of that side of things?
I didn't. So it's a funny story because you're saying that, right? So I remember, I'm making these amplifiers, and I'm trying to think of who I sold one to, but somehow or another, it's like I sold an amplifier to somebody in like 1998 or 99, somewhere around there. I don't remember. maybe it was even later than that. I don't remember. But all of a sudden, my phone just is ringing a lot. And I'm like, what's going on? And they're all ordering this one amplifier. They all want this split front JTM 45 thing all the time, or this 18 watter I was building. And I'm like, okay, so it starts taking off. And I had no idea what's going on. None. Right? It wasn't even occurring to me. I didn't even find out until years later about something called the Les Paul Forum. And that all of them that I was selling an amp to were on this forum. And I didn't even know it existed. Right? So it was shocking to me because I didn't know that was even a thing. Right? So, yeah, I think I've always been like the last guy using a calculator. So, versus a laptop, or the last guy using a slide rule as opposed to a calculator. I'm always, people are telling me, you're 15 years ago. That's where you are all the time. And maybe it was a good thing, maybe it was a bad thing, but I didn't get into take advantage of that. But let's say around when Three Monkeys started, right? So then it became a matter of necessity, because I'm now in a business with another person, and my partner, Greg, right, is very tech savvy, right? He's in what you would call the early adopter, right? He's going to be the first guy. Like he was definitely the Usenet, right? Back in the day, he was probably on ARPANET. He was probably doing all that stuff way back when, on forums, checking things out. I think he told me that he found me through the Les Paul forum for Aerosmith, right? And that's how he got my contact information, that he was going through one of those forums and they were using one of my amplifiers. Like, I got to get one of these for Brad to try out. So that's how it started. But when it came into, that time, I started to, look back at all of it. And I was like, okay, so there's the Les Paul forum. Then there's my Les Paul forum, which I actually did participate in a tiny bit. It was like a year where I used to go to it and read like they had like a little corner amp builders forum or something like that. And they also had like a luthier's corner in there for guys that build guitars. And I also build guitars, which I love doing, right? I can make like Les Paul replicas or, Gibson Carina replicas, all that kind of stuff. So I spent a lot of time just watching what other people were doing with building guitars, to see like their jigs and seeing like how they solved problems. Like, how did you get the curved truss slot? Like, how did you do this? How did you do that? How did you carve the top? And I would also then go into the amp builders forum, and I would almost get the courage to look up Three Monkeys and see what was being said. But I would like do it, and then I'd be like, I can't read this because what if it's bad? So I feel like anything that someone says to you, good or bad, isn't real. You're not as good as you think you are, and you're not as bad as you think you are. You're somewhere in the middle, right? And some people are going to have a skewed preference for you or a skewed negativity towards you. But I don't think anything that anybody ever says about what you do is real. I think that is only, a matter of a perception, and perceptions are real to the individual, but they're not universal. So to say that they're a universal truth, to me, was not real. So reading it to me seemed counterproductive, because I was either going to feel terrible or I was going to feel great. And neither one of those were justified. So I really wanted to stay away from it. And honestly, it's like doing stuff on YouTube has been tough, right? So that's sort of the same thing, but now you're exposing yourself to opinions, and you're sort of like hearing from the public and things like that. And it's tough, so I try to, I'm learning a little bit more to deal with, being very even in terms of being able to still follow my voice in my head, but still be able to interact with people, which is difficult for someone like me, because I don't know, I'm weird. I understand that I'm a weirdo, and I know that sometimes that comes off that way. And I just, I have to learn, just to be accepting of myself, I think, is what it is.
I mean, that's my last question on this subject, Ossie, which is getting into that. So you said a few minutes ago that you're not, I can't remember, you're not a good learner. I think you said something about that. You're unteachable, I think you said.
Yeah.
But on YouTube, you're teaching, right? You've been building a José over multiple videos, you've been going through the Marshmallow, you've been teaching people about all the differences in Eddie's tones and blah, 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 blah. How have you found that? Has that affected your reputation or how you're sort of viewed as a professional builder or modder? What have you got coming back from that?
I don't know. I mean, I think everything you do has to affect perception, right? Anything that's visible that you do affects perception, right? So like today, I'm putting on this shirt and I'm like, this is kind of odd for me to look this way, usually, because I'm usually dressed like a roadie, right? I'm wearing like a black t-shirt and like camo pants or something like that, right? And my hair is pretty short and neatly cut, and it's been in a ponytail. It's been, all over the place like this. And it's been crazy. I've been all different kinds of things. I don't know. So perception is always there. So the Eddie thing was always like, I thought of it as being like, in some ways, a dark secret that maybe I shouldn't let anybody know, because maybe I'm just going to be pigeonholed as another one of those idiots, because I think that people that chase that sound are labeled as unoriginal, kind of people who don't have the ability or the understanding that they need to get their own sound. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, there is a subsection of people that are more interested in sound than they are in the actual notes that are being played. It's sort of like, all right, so in the Van Halen world, I consider there to be like 3 or 2 different sort of people. One of them is like, Van Halen, fuck yeah, drink beer, smash stuff, drive my car really fast, that kind of stuff. And then there's other guys who are like, how did it, what was Eddie feeling when he wrote this? Or what was Ted Templeman doing? Like, what are the relationships between Doobie Brothers albums and Van Halen albums? Like, why do they sound so similar? Well, how does this work together? It's like, putting, sriracha sauce on popcorn. Something like that. It's like, why is this working? And they're looking at things in like more of a metaphysical way, or they're looking at it in a more serious way, towards the sound versus the idea of like a rock band. So I fit more into that first thing. Like, I wish they would release all the albums without any vocals on them, or just with the guitar tracks, or just Ed and Alex, so I could hear the interplay of the stuff and hear it a little bit better, because you always hear things differently when they're isolated. So yeah, I was worried that it was going to affect my reputation in the sense of being able to appeal to a wider audience in the sense that Three Monkeys would, because we were building things, I've built amplifiers for guys like Roger Stevens from Blind Melon, all the way through to, Jimmy Hazel, right? From Spies, right? And you couldn't get too far apart, right? From the sound of this thing, right? And so it kind of made me feel like, oh, he's just a Van Halen guy. If you want, like a Voxy sounding amp, forget it. He doesn't know, he can't do that kind of thing. So I was worried that it was going to negatively affect everything. But I feel that anything in this world that you're passionate about can be used as a vehicle to explain more than just the topic that you're trying to get to talk about. So talking about Eddie can lead into so many different areas of, metaphysics, right? Like rider and horse, like who is doing what? When Eddie's playing the guitar, he's responding to his guitar is responding to him. There's a back and forth. It's not total imposition of will in one direction, right? His rig is imposing its will on him while he's imposing his will on that. And the two are working together. And how does this relationship create these moments that we hear? How does this work? Why is it that he sounds different than everybody else? What is it about Don Landy, right? What is it about him that creates this unified sound that he has that you can hear in Doobie Brothers vocals, or you can hear in, the way that he tracked Ed's guitars and mastered them. So, there's different kinds of ways of exploring anything, and anything can be used as a vehicle. So like teaching things, I often thought it's like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance is like Zen in the art of the Brown sound. I mean, this topic could lead you anywhere, so it's more than just amps. It's a whole thing, a whole vehicle.
Cool. Thanks, Ossie. So the Brown sound deep dives didn't pigeonhole you in the way that you were afraid they would, because there's so much scope within that subject, that you can touch on lots of different areas.
Yeah, and I never wanted to approach it in the way that I'm telling you how it's done, right? Because I don't know, right? No one knows. Right. It's total speculation. It's what ifs, and it's inquisitive, right? I think it's also in some ways it's like Socratic, right? So you question everything, right? There's no question that is out of bounds. You're to have a dialogue here. It's to go back and forth. You're to take every single aspect of the topic and question it, and pose a theory, and then see if you could destroy your theory. See if it holds up. So take any theory and just try it out. And it's not like, I know the secret and this is it. I'm telling you how it is. And if you don't listen to me, you're an idiot. It's like, what if it was this way? Like, let's try this. Let's try that. And you find in the end, there's more than one way to get where you want to go. There always is, right? And which way you choose to do it is sort of up to, like you were talking about before, with what you have available to you, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe you could get there with what you got. You don't have to go my way. You know what I'm saying? So it opens up things for people, I think, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, I think you got the last two questions.
I do indeed. Yeah. First, just want to say I really like what you're saying about the Brown sound being this thing that can just open up in so many directions. I've done a good bit of writing on Van Halen, and I think I want to share some of it with you at some point, because I feel like that's been my approach to think about him. So not for now, but touch base later. Last two questions are thinking a little more big picture about like some of the ways in which amp technologies have evolved. And so I want to ask you if you have any, I think this has come up in some of our conversation already, but just to kind of bring it a little more into focus, how do you think that the kinds of modifications of Marshall amps that you've worked on and that others have worked on have fed back into the broader field of amplification design? Like, can you think of specific amp designs that have that are not just reproductions, but that have been very obviously informed by this impulse that is there in modification of Marshall amps?
There's a lot, right? You could start off with maybe, I don't know, the first production that I'm wrong about this, but the SLO, right? The Soldano Super Lead Overdrive, right? The SLO amp was exactly that, right? So Mike was modifying Marshalls, I believe, to begin with, and then took that particular design he had and housed it in a chassis in a particular design philosophy, and that was the SLO. So that would be one. You could have something like the Ecstasy, right? The Bogner amplifiers definitely came out of modified Marshalls. Obviously, Dave, right? Friedman, he's got a whole line, right, of basic modified Marshalls in different ways. You could go, Peavey, right? Peaveys, the 5150s, Butchers. I mean, they basically have the same architecture as a Marshall, right? They use very similar sort of architecture. They have the same phase inverter, cathode followers, additional gain stages. They, use something that's close to being like a Celestion speaker, right? Sheffields or things like that. Egnator, Bruce is another guy. I don't know if you've talked to Bruce Egnator, but Bruce is like, he's a godfather, I think. He's like up there for sure. in terms of his contribution to the amplifier world, how many designs he's actually behind that people don't even know, right? That he actually designed for companies. So I'm going to leave out so many, but there's a whole group of amplifiers, a whole village of amplifiers that came out of the modifications that we're doing, right? I mean, that's just absolutely the way it is. So there's more than one, and it is a thing for sure, for sure.
Can you maybe just elaborate a little more on where you see your amps fitting into that larger trajectory?
Okay. I don't know. I think that's up to the general public to decide, but so I like to, I mean, like something like the One or something like that. I try to use it uses a principle that I don't think other people have capitalized on, right? Which is sort of like that interplay between resistance on the other side of the output transformer and how it sort of changes the way that the power tubes work, so to speak. So if there's anything that I would like to try to glom onto, it would be kind of finding ways of influencing a stock Marshall from not going now into it and changing it internally, but pressuring it from the outside to make it respond differently to the environment and sound differently as a result of that. You know what I'm saying? So it's more external influence versus internal modification in a way. So the whole theory of the marshmallow is just how it's loaded. And that's the end of it. It's not really, changing a tube stage or a capacitor value or adding stages of gain to it. It's really just letting the amplifier be itself, but put it in a situation where it's less comfortable. Yeah. So I think that's where it would sit, but I don't really know. I mean, I'm really doing this because I want to have the things. Like when I'm making something, it's because I want it. It's not because I'm like, I think this might sell. It's like, I want to make this for myself. I think this is where I want to try. I want to try this and I want to use it. And then I make it. And that thing was just like other people, like, can you make me one? So I made just 19 of them, and that was it. And that's the end of it. Done. Right. I just build them for a few people. It's an odd thing that people, may or may not like because it's very much a sniper rifle and very obscure and bizarre in a way. So, I don't know what it's going to do, but it's more I built it for myself. And if other people appreciate it and have at it sort of thing, so I don't know where I'd fit in. I don't even know if I do fit in, somewhere I might, I don't know.
Yeah. Great. Well, this is the last formal question we have, at least,
Sure.
Which is, how do you see the future of this kind of endeavor, amp modding, and the community around it evolving in light of all the shifts towards digital modeling
Sure.
and the newer kind of modes of amp design that have assumed so much currency in the last couple of decades?
Right. I think that's a very important question. And I think it's something I've given some thought to. And it's something that it needs to work its way through and see where it will land. But my basic impression of it is this. So when you're discussing something like modeling something, right? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to model something that's in a universe that has to deal with things like entropy, has to deal with randomness, right? So every day that you plug into this amplifier, it's different. Every second that you're using this amplifier, it's different. The electrons that are coming off are different. The way that the electricity is coming through the wall is different. The way that there's an infinite amount of randomness that's happening to create this sound. And I think an analog to that would be a drum machine versus a drummer. Now, every time that a drummer hits that snare, it's going to hit it a little different, right? It's going to come a little bit off here, a little bit here. It's going to be a little harder. Maybe the drumstick's a little bit off. Maybe it's held more in his hand. Every time he hits the skin's going to change. It's going to change tone. Every time he hits the skin, the air in the room is going to be slightly different. The temperatures are changing. All of these things, the microphone that's recording it is degrading. The tape that's on it is doing all these things. So any kind of digital modeling has to take into account an infinite amount of randomness. And if in computer science, randomness is not possible, right? Computers are based in, especially these sort of impulse responders, are algorithms. And algorithms are repetitive mathematical formulas, right? They can get more complex, meaning that the amount of, let's say, digits of the solution may go further out, right? It's like pi 3.14 versus 3.1 blah, 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 to wherever, right? So every single time that it tries to go further in randomness and capturing randomness, it's going to require more computing power, right? So a drum machine, every time that you press that drum machine, it's going to spit out the same digital noise, right? Let's say like an 808, right? Because that's an early machine, right? It's going to spit out the same kind of thing. It's going to be a little bit more analog because we're dealing with some, CMOS, or we're dealing with some transistors, a little more analog. But a digital machine is basically purely digital, is going to spit out the same group of numbers, the same binary code to create that sound. And it's going to sound that way, right? And it's going to sound artificial because it's repetitive and it's not giving the randomness that our ears hear. So they've developed these algorithms that they're better at doing randomness. Like there's these things like they're called like permutated, what are they called? Permutated congruential generators. And these are very advanced algorithms that can go out further and further, but the more advanced they become, the more computing power they suck up, and the larger the CPU has to be, the more calculations it has to do. And in my opinion, it's never going to be able to model analog 100%. Now, for the recording industry, it may be very practical in the sense that when I go in, that was what I always love about like the aux box, right? For my own experiments, every day I went in to listen to creating a recorded Van Halen sound. It wasn't that the mic had drooped overnight a millimeter and now all my data sucks because the mic has moved a millimeter, right? And I'm just chasing my tail now because I don't know if the mic was moved and now it sounds totally different. So at least the aux gave me a repetitive result that then I could eliminate as a variable in what I was doing here. Right. So it had its purpose. And I understand that too, that for recording, maybe it makes sense that it's less intensive, right? That you don't have to worry so much, that you can get a repetitive result. If you blow some tracks, you can come back tomorrow. It's going to sound the same. You're not going to have to worry, right? And it's economic. It's all of the above. It's faster. You don't need as much room. So there's a space for it. And maybe a lot of people don't really care. They can't hear it, But I think that there's always going to be a place for analog in there. So digital can be in digital, but I think in some ways it has to come back into the analog world, right? At some point, it's going to go from D to A again, right? It's going to go from A to D and D to A. So it's going to be analog at first. So there's going to be natural randomness. It's going to come into this machine. And then some randomness that's, less than natural is going to take hold, but then it's got to go into the natural environment. So I think if there's a way to adapt the output to be more random, to be more analog, I think it can solve some of those problems. But I think in general, I see that there's a place for both of these things. I think that they'll work together synergistically. I don't think you can have just one and be totally satisfied with the result. I don't know. Does that make sense to you? I mean, how do you feel?
It does make sense to me. And I mean, I think it makes sense to me too, that your allegiance is going to be with the analog because that's your bread and butter. And it's the sound that you have so much investment in. I guess I wonder, you mentioned that particular sort of algorithm that's getting a little bit better at starting to emulate some of the randomness. I guess I'd just ask, do you think there are any designers who are doing the digital mods or amp sims that you think are making a significant contribution to the kinds of tonal quest that you see yourself committed to, or do you really see it as like kind of two separate worlds?
Well, I would think that if somebody, I can't name anybody specifically, but I think if somebody were to go, in a sense, to just try to more accurately model analog gear to where it could be used in a creative process the same way that the actual gear would be used, I think that you would be closer to it, as opposed to trying to create a solution that is many things in one package, so to speak, right? So the idea of having, let's say, a specific guitar tone, and you're just buying that one tone, and in that tone is, it's going to have, it's going to be a ribbon mic, an SM57 is going to have this compressor, this blah, 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 and it's going to end up with a sound. I think if it were to break it up and to where it's user controlled, so that you could say, I want to put this compressor, I want to put this, and you were to be able to manipulate that, I think that would be a more useful thing for a guitar player. I think we're in the infancy of that right now because the computational power needed to do that is just not practical. And then you're dealing with latency issues, right? How fast can this system actually produce the sound to where you can play this thing and you're not like, because the sound is 5 to 7, 8 milliseconds delayed, right? Where it's totally making you feel like you're on acid or something. It's so I think that's still a long way off. I think we're still in the infancy of all this. But I've said there is not enough computing power in the world to properly model a fart. There isn't. It's not possible, right? Because it has to model the entire universe, including itself inside the universe responding to it, which becomes, it becomes sort of like a never-ending sort of like series of a loop that it could get caught in, right? So I just don't think it's possible. I just don't see it. It seems like we're tempted by the promise of something, and maybe we're psychologically fooling ourselves that it's working. I don't know, but we'll have to see where it lands. Is the goal of this to create a digital reality? Because we kind of have that. You know what I mean? We sort of have reality. We don't really need to make a digital one, do we? I don't know.
I guess the question is, Ossie, are we trying to model a fart or the sound of a fart? There's a bit. Sorry to go. Just to tie into these questions, are you familiar with any of the kind of maybe captures of? Have you encountered any captures of your work, for example, any of the Marshmallows or the José mods or have you encountered any of that stuff as it came back to you in a different form?
I don't know if it's come back to me, but I've been doing it, right? So
you've been doing it, right?
Yeah, I get a kick out of it. So I did get one of these neural DSP nanos, right? The nano cortex, which is a little pedal, right? And you can do sort of like neural captures of things. Mm-hmm. I've been using also this other thing, which is FabEQ, right? Which is sort of like a Pro Tools plugin. And what it does is it's able to compare two audio signals and sort of come up with a parametric EQ solution, which is, beyond what any analog parametric EQ could do, right? The Qs are insanely narrow or insanely wide, and the gain can be, absurd. And the gain in terms of like signal to noise ratio is, you're not going to see that in analog. So I've been taking like the Marshmallow and then taking like record albums like 1984 or something like that, and taking the raw tracks, taking the Marshmallow sound, having FabEQ compare the two, and then superimpose a parametric solution to make it sound like 1984. And then I run my Nano Cortex through the Marshmallow, through the computer, out of the computer, back into the Nano, and capture the whole basically like recorded signal chain. And then I could just play that through, a pair of full range monitors in the living room. And although it's, it's not perfect, I'm like, every time I play it, I smile. I'm like, that sounds like 1984. It's bizarre, or it sounds like I did like, Crazy Train. And it's like, it sounds exactly like Crazy Train. It has the same like 7K peak in it, but it has on top of that so many more dips and valleys of such a high Q point that it's, replicating phasing issues. It's replicating all these, anomalies of the recording process that, it's startling. So I see that as something that is definitely going to put smiles on people's faces. So I'm all for that. But at the same time, it's like, you cannot, and I've done this, you cannot take a deluxe reverb, right? And put like a clon in front of it and then put it through that and have it sound like Van Halen. It doesn't work, right? You still need that, somehow or another, you still need that core sound to then just tweak a little bit. And then it gets there, right? So you got to get as close as you can possibly analog, and then you could go into the digital world. The other thing I should say about digital real quickly, I know we're running out of time. So like artificial intelligence is basically like a glorified search engine in a sense, right? With more decision-making capabilities, more speed, more whatever. It is searching the analog world for its answers, right? So these plugins, what are you modeling? Right? You want to model analog. So even if you're going to be doing a lot of digital, I still think that there's a place for analog in sort of like creating the digital, right? You need the clay to make the model. You can't just, start with the model. There has to be the dirt in the water. You have to start with that to make the model. So I think, and even in that sense, there are people teaching AI right now in their fields, right? If you're an expert in a particular field, you may be sitting there getting paid to tell the AI how to think, So I think there's always going to be a spot for analog.
Can I just ask one last question, Ossie? Sure. It's way past dinner time over here, but there's a really interesting thing I just want to rewind back to. I can't remember exactly what I asked you. It was about getting influence from modders or something like that, and you kind of said no, you don't. You said something about a persona. You build up this persona of the modder. So I want to understand that a little bit more. Are you saying that you're building this persona and then you're thinking how they would approach a mod? Is that, or am I putting words in your mouth by saying that? It's like an embodied thing. You were actually getting into their mindset.
Yeah,
but you were getting into the mindset of the persona. Is that so? Tell me a bit more how that works out, because it's really interesting.
I don't even know how to explain it. It just occurred to me right now. Maybe it's like being a profiler, like for the FBI, getting into the mind of the serial killer. I don't know. It's something like that. But it's like, if I'm thinking of like Jose, I'm thinking of like the whole LA thing, and I'm trying to get the feeling of that. And then I'm working on the amplifier and I'm playing it and I'm like, yeah, that's the fucking era, right? That's it right there. That's the feeling. It's giving me that feeling of what I imagined that time to be like, right? And then I feel it's right, because music is emotional, right? It's emotion. It's absolutely communication of emotions and feeling and of context and of information that cannot be put into words. It's another form of communication. So if I could get the feel of the jive of what I think this is, and I'm probably totally wrong because I wasn't there, I use that to get to where I want to be. Like once I feel like I'm feeling that in my head and in my heart when I'm playing it, then I got it. So, I mean, it's like a,
but I
don't even know how to explain it.
You're kind of, so you're saying you're kind of channeling your decision, your process through this imagined persona of Jose. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Which is kind of like an embodied experience.
Of the whole backstory of everything that they're doing, trying to think like they thought, because I think a lot of times when people are posed with the same problems, they come up with the same solutions too, right? Mm-hmm. So if you put yourself in their shoes, a lot of times you think that you'll come up with the same thoughts, because humans think the same way, right? We're kind of like, creatures like, dogs think the same way. You can kind of figure out what they're going to do. You can train them. You can do things. We're kind of like that. We're animals. We think very similarly. So if I'm like thinking I'm in like, it's like being a method actor, right? I'm like walking around all day like, I'm, Donnie Brasco over here. You know what I'm saying? And trying to be, like I'm in 1977 LA on Sunset Strip. And like, what am I trying to be like? It's like, what do I want this to sound like? So I could go get out there and like, just like, knock everybody over with the sound kind of thing. I don't want to sound like modern, right? I'm not trying to sound like it's an Uberschall. There's a time for that, or like a triple rectifier, like 1997 or 1998. Time for that too, right? If I wanted to make that, I'd be thinking of like Creed, right? Of like, of that era, that sound, what I'm saying, which defined that musical era, right? What would create that? So if I'm thinking like I'm a 1970s like LA hard rock player, I'm going to get closer, I think, to it than if I'm just like, what capacitor should I use?
So rather than looking at a Jose schematic that someone's reverse engineered in a forum, you're gonna channel your inner Jose in 1983 in his little workshop in Southern California somewhere.
Yeah, in a sense too, I'm gonna know what he's got in his shop, right? So that's part of it. It's like cooking, right? You go into someone's kitchen. If you go into like my father's kitchen, when he was alive or whatever, you're probably gonna come out making something like a curry. Right, or something like that. Go into my mom's kitchen, you're going to boil some potatoes, or something like that, right? So you go into Jose's kitchen, you're going to see, Zener diodes, you're going to see, this shielded wire, you're going to see, this kind of stuff. So you're like, all right, I'm working with that material. Let's use that stuff that he's got, and let's see what we can do with it, and work with it until it sounds the way I would want it to sound like if I was back then, and then. It's sort of like in the right genre, right? Because you wouldn't want to do it like, like for instance, Eddie. Eddie could not have done Van Halen 1 with a SLO necessarily, right? It's a different sound. He couldn't have done for unlawful carnal knowledge with a plexi, as much. Those two things are lending to an era and to a sound and to a feel. And he, Rider and Horse again, he played with the amp, and the amp played with him, and it provided him with certain advantages that he took advantage of and certain drawbacks that he tried to stay away from, and created the sound of it. So I think it's important to sort of be faithful to the era, and then you're going to get pretty damn close, right? And these guys are eras too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant, awesome. Yeah, I just thought I'd rewind on that one. I thought it was really interesting when you made that point, and it's been playing in my head there for the last hour and a half. So also, we've been talking a while.
Yeah,
we've been talking nearly 2.5 hours, but it's been fascinating
I
stuff.
Like this for like 40 hours. It could go on like this forever. We'll start talking about like, I don't know what, like parallel dimensions pretty soon.
Steve, have you got any closing questions you want to catch up with Ossie? Have we covered everything? Anything in your head?
I think I'm good for now. I mean, as you just said, Ossie, I feel like we could continue the conversation, in innumerable ways, but I feel like we've gotten great material out of you, and there's lots to think about. So thank you so much. That's
good to hear, because I was really worried this was going to be like, oh my God, what are we doing with this idiot?
Not even a little bit.
No, absolutely not. It's been a great interview, Ossie. It's you've given us, you've definitely given us a different, fresh take on a lot of things, and a very unique way of looking at it. So yeah, we've loved it. It's been great. We've really enjoyed having you.
Of being included in your study, and I look forward to the end results. And if you ever want to do anything again, I'm down for it too. And Steve, if you ever wanted to talk about some Van Halen, maybe when we get off the cast here, we can. I'll give you guys my phone number too, so what have you, we can emails we can exchange, and maybe we could do another podcast or something sometime. That'd be kind of fun. Yeah.
That sounds like a podcast, Steve, with your name on it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'll be down. No doubt.
Awesome. All right, brilliant. Okay, well, we'll definitely stay in touch, Ossie, and we'll get you various bits and bobs. And yeah, absolute pleasure. And we've had a really great time speaking to you.
Myself, this was a pleasure. I enjoyed it very much. It's what, 8:15 over in the UK right now. Where are you, Steve? Are you in the UK as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'm from the U.S., but I've Austin's colleague at the University of Huddersfield now for about 18 months. So,
yeah, my sister lives in Surrey.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So maybe I'll get over there sometime and come bother you.
You should do, Ossie. You're more than welcome.
Got a good setup up here. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you.